The supply cart hit the wall before anyone could breathe. Officer Derek Mast had one hand wrapped around the wrist of a nurse half his size, the other pressed flat against her collarbone, pinning her against the metal shelving while IV bags swayed and syringes scattered across the floor. The ER of Callaway Regional Medical Center went dead silent. Doctors frozen mid-step, patients craning from their gurneys, a monitor somewhere still beeping because the machines didn't know enough to stop. The nurse didn't scream, she didn't cry. She looked up at him with dark, steady eyes and said something no one else could hear. And then the front doors exploded open. 3 black vehicles, no markings, no sirens, stopped hard on the ambulance bay concrete, and the men who stepped out weren't local police. They weren't hospital security. They wore combat gear and carried weapons that had no business being inside a civilian hospital in Denton Falls, Montana. Derek Mast had spent 11 years believing his badge was the most powerful thing in any room he walked into. He was about to find out how wrong he was. If this story already has you hooked, stay with me all the way to the end. Like this video, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The shift started at 6 in the morning, which meant Lauren Voss had already been awake for an hour before that, sitting at her kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee she didn't finish, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. That was the thing about working trauma for 6 years. You stopped being able to sleep the way normal people did. Your brain stayed on a kind of low-frequency alert even when nothing was happening, listening for something that wasn't there. Lauren had tried explaining it to her sister once, and her sister had looked at her the way people look at someone speaking a language they used to know but forgot. It wasn't a complaint. It was just a fact about what the work did to you over time. She was 28 years old. She had brown hair that she kept pulled back so tight it gave her a headache by noon most days. She was 5'4", 130 pounds, and she had a small scar on her left forearm from a piece of shrapnel she'd taken outside Kandahar when she was 23, on her second deployment as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. She didn't talk about that. Most people at Callaway Regional had no idea, and she preferred it that way. The past had a weight to it, and she'd learned that the best way to carry it was to set it down somewhere quiet and not pick it up unless she had to. She drove to the hospital in the pre-dawn dark, parked in the far lot because the closer ones always filled up before her shift, and walked through the ambulance bay with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her stethoscope around her neck. The bay smelled like exhaust and antiseptic. 2 paramedics she recognized were offloading a gurney, an older man, oxygen mask, possible stroke, and she held the door for them without thinking about it, stepping aside, reading the situation the way she always did. Callaway Regional was a mid-sized hospital in Denton Falls, a city of about 90,000 people spread across a valley between 2 mountain ranges in western Montana. It wasn't a major trauma center, but it handled everything from car accidents to hunting injuries to the occasional agricultural emergency that came in looking like something from a different century. The ER was perpetually understaffed and perpetually busy, and the staff had developed the particular brand of gallows humor that comes from working too hard for too long in a system that was always one bad week away from collapse. Lauren liked it there, mostly. She trusted the doctors she worked with. She knew which attending would actually listen to her when she flagged something unusual, and which ones would nod and move on and circle back 20 minutes later like they'd thought of it themselves. She knew which residents were going to be excellent and which ones were going to wash out. She knew where every piece of equipment was in every bay, could navigate the supply room blind, and had once talked a terrified medical student through a procedure while simultaneously starting an IV and watching the door for an incoming trauma. She was good at her job the way some people are good at things, not because it came effortlessly, but because she'd put in the hours and the failures and the hard lessons until competence became something she could rely on. She clocked in, got her assignment from the charge nurse, a compact, no-nonsense woman named Pat Drury who'd been running ER floors since before Lauren was born, and started her rounds. The morning was busy in the way that Monday mornings always were. A 7-year-old with a fractured wrist, an elderly woman with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal but warranted monitoring anyway, a construction worker who'd taken a nail gun bolt through his palm and was handling it with the kind of stoic irritation that Lauren had come to associate with men who worked outdoors for a living. She moved between bays efficiently, charted as she went, kept half an eye on the board where patient status was tracked, and dry erase marker that someone was always updating. At 9:43, the ambulance bay doors opened and two Denton Falls Police Department officers walked in. Lauren noticed them the way she noticed everything, automatically, without particular emphasis. Officers came through the ER regularly. Sometimes they were accompanying a suspect, sometimes a victim. Sometimes they were there for a welfare check that had escalated. It was part of the ecosystem of the place. The first officer was someone she'd seen before, a younger guy named Pitt, who was generally fine, kept to himself, didn't make trouble. The second one she recognized too, though she wished she didn't. Derek Mast was 41, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of physical confidence that occupies more space than the body actually takes up. He'd been with the Denton Falls PD for 11 years and wore that tenure like it was a rank. Lauren had seen him in the ER maybe a half dozen times over the past 2 years. Twice he'd been professional. The other 4 times, he'd been the kind of difficult that made other staff members disappear into back hallways and suddenly find reasons to be somewhere else. He was escorting a man in handcuffs, mid-30s, a bruise forming along his jawline, clearly in no immediate danger. And he walked straight to the triage desk with the posture of someone who doesn't expect to wait. "This one needs to be seen," Mast said to Lauren, who happened to be standing at the desk updating a chart. She looked at the detainee. She looked at her board. There were 4 patients ahead of him, including a 49-year-old woman in Bay 3 who was showing early signs of septic shock. "We'll get him checked in and triaged," Lauren said. "There's a wait." "How long?" "Hard to say. We have some critical patients ahead." Mast's jaw shifted. He looked at her the way some men look at a wall they want to go through. "He's in custody. That means he moves up the list." "It doesn't work that way," Lauren said. She kept her voice even. "We triage by medical urgency, not by legal status. If he's in distress, tell me specifically what's going on and we'll assess accordingly." "He hit his head." "Is he symptomatic? Confused? Vomiting? Loss of consciousness?" "He's got a bump." Lauren looked at the detainee again. He met her eyes briefly and then looked away. The bruise on his jaw was already darkening, but it wasn't severe. "We'll get him registered and evaluated in order," she said. "That's the best I can do." Mast leaned slightly over the counter, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You want to be the one telling me my guy waits because of some policy?" "Yes," Lauren said simply. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he straightened up, and something behind his eyes went flat and deliberate, in a way that she recognized but didn't let herself react to. "Fine," he said. "We'll wait." He didn't move toward the waiting area. He stayed at the counter with Officer Pitt, the handcuffed detainee standing between them, and watched Lauren go back to her work with the kind of attention that was designed to make her feel it. She felt it. She ignored it and kept moving. The woman in Bay 3 was her priority. The patient's name was Glenda Marsh, 51, not 49. Lauren had misread the intake, and she'd come in 2 hours ago with what her husband described as a fever and some confusion. The attending on shift, Dr. Ramon Alcazar, had already ordered blood cultures and a broad-spectrum antibiotic push, but Glenda's pressure had been trending down in the last hour, and she wasn't responding the way she should have been. Lauren went in, checked her vitals personally, rather than just reading the monitor, and found that the numbers on the screen were a little rosier than the patient in front of her. Glenda's skin was mottled at the extremities. Her responses were slow. "Dr. Alcazar." Lauren caught him in the hallway outside the bay. "Martian 3. She's worse than the monitors showing. I think she's compensating." He stopped walking immediately. That was one of the things Lauren liked about Alcazar. He stopped. "How bad?" "Pressure looks okay on the screen, but her skin's mottling and her mentation is down from baseline even from 2 hours ago. Husband says she was coherent when she came in. She's not coherent now." "Let's look at her." They went in together, and within 4 minutes, Alcazar had called for a rapid response and ordered a second IV line and a lactate level. He also ordered a transfer to the ICU pending availability. The process wasn't glamorous. It was a series of quick decisions made by tired people with incomplete information, doing the best they could with what they had. That was what the work actually looked like most of the time. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just fast, methodical, and occasionally everything standing between a person and the worst possible outcome. Lauren was running the second line when Pat Drury appeared at the bay entrance. "Mast is asking again," Pat said, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who has delivered this message on behalf of an irritating person and wants it noted that she finds it equally irritating. Getting loud about it. "Tell him we're with a critical patient." "I told him. He said," and I'm quoting, "I don't care what you're doing, I need someone out there." Alcazar looked up from his tablet briefly and then looked back down, which was his version of saying, "I'm not touching this one." "I'll be out in 5 minutes," Lauren said. "Tell him 5 minutes." Pat disappeared. Lauren finished what she was doing, handed off the monitoring to a tech, and went back to the floor. Mast was standing in the middle of the ER corridor, not the waiting area. The corridor. The detainee was sitting in a chair nearby, Officer Pitt leaning against the wall looking like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. 2 other nurses had found reasons to relocate. A patient on a gurney in the hallway was watching the whole thing with the focused interest of someone with nothing better to do. "Officer Mast," Lauren said, walking toward him. "I understand you've been waiting, as I explained earlier." "As you explained," he repeated, and his voice had a particular color to it now. Not loud, but designed to carry. "You, a nurse. You explain to me how this is going to go." "Yes." "You know what I find interesting? I've been coming to this hospital for 11 years, never had trouble before, never had some nurse tell me to sit down and wait my turn." "I'm sorry to hear that," Lauren said, "but the process hasn't changed. When you're ready to get me someone else." She paused. "Excuse me?" "I want a different nurse. Someone who understands how these things work." Lauren looked at him steadily. She was aware of the people watching, the tech at the station who'd stopped pretending to type, the transport aide who'd slowed her cart, the patient on the gurney who'd gone very still. "All of our nursing staff follows the same triage protocols," she said. "Switching you to another nurse won't change your position on the list." "Then I want to speak to administration." "You're welcome to. The nursing supervisor is Patricia Drury, and I can let her know you'd like to speak with her." "I want a manager, not a supervisor." "Of course. I'll make that call." She turned to do exactly that. "I'm not done talking to you." She turned back. He was looking at her the way people look at something they've decided they don't respect, which is different from the way they look at something they're angry at. Anger has heat. This was colder. "You think this is over," he said, "because you followed your little checklist. But I'm going to be here all day, and you're going to keep seeing my face, and by the time we're done, you're going to wish you'd just been reasonable." Lauren held his gaze for a moment before she spoke. "My job is to make sure patients get the care they need in the order they need it. Your detainee will be evaluated. If you want to speak with hospital administration, I'll make that call. Is there anything else you need from me medically?" Silence. "Then I'm going to get back to my patients," she said, and she turned and walked away, and she didn't let herself feel the weight of his stare on her back until she was around the corner and out of his line of sight. In the supply closet where she went to get extra tubing for Bay 3, she stood alone for 45 seconds. Breathed. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady in worse situations than this, in places far from western Montana, in circumstances this man couldn't imagine. She knew that. It didn't make it easier exactly, but it made it containable. She went back to work. The administration call went more or less as she expected. The hospital administrator on duty that day was a man named Gerald Fossey, who was 47 years old, wore a suit in a building where everyone else wore scrubs or uniforms, and whose primary professional goal in any given situation appeared to be the prevention of paperwork. He came down to the ER within 15 minutes of being paged, spoke to Mast in a low voice near the waiting room for about 8 minutes, and then asked Lauren to step into the small consultation room off the main corridor. "I appreciate that you're following protocol," Fossey said, which was the administrative way of beginning a sentence that was going to end somewhere she didn't want to go. "But," she said, "Officer Mast has expressed that he feels the department hasn't been given appropriate consideration, And given our relationship with the DFPD, is the detainee's medical condition more urgent than what I assessed? Fossey paused. That's not really because if it is, I'm happy to reprioritize. But if it's not, I'm not sure what you're asking me to do. I'm asking you to find a way to be more accommodating. I can be more accommodating in my tone. I can make sure he feels heard. I can't move a custody patient ahead of a septic patient. That's not something I'm willing to do, and I'd ask you to put in writing that you're directing me to do it if that's the direction you're giving. Fossey looked at her for a long moment. He did not offer to put anything in writing. Just try to keep things calm, he said, and left. Lauren went back to the floor. Mast's detainee was eventually triaged and evaluated. His head laceration was minor, no neurological symptoms, and he was treated and cleared within about 40 minutes of actually being seen. Mast signed the paperwork with the exaggerated care of someone performing their displeasure for an audience and left. Lauren thought that was the end of it. She was wrong. At 2:15 in the afternoon, she was at the nursing station entering documentation when her phone buzzed with a text from Pat Drury. Heads up, Fossey met with Mast again. Don't know what was said. Lauren stared at the message for a moment, then put her phone down and went back to typing. At 3:40, she was helping transfer a post-cardiac patient when one of the ER techs, a 22-year-old named Josie, who'd started 3 months ago and was still in the phase where everything surprised her, came to find her. There's a complaint filed, Josie said, and her voice had the quality of someone delivering bad news and not quite knowing how much. With administration, against you. What kind of complaint? Unprofessional conduct, refusing care to a patient in police custody. Lauren straightened up slowly. The patient on the gurney had fallen asleep. He refused to wait, she said. We saw him and cleared him. I know, Josie said. I was there for part of it. Okay. Lauren looked at the wall for a moment. Thanks for telling me. She went to find Pat. Pat had the complaint on her tablet. It was a formal document, Denton Falls PD letterhead, signed by Derek Mast and countersigned by his sergeant, a man named Walt Creed. It accused Lauren by name of deliberately withholding timely medical care from a detainee in police custody, and it requested a formal review of her conduct and credentials. Lauren read it twice. The language was precise in a way that suggested it had been reviewed before being filed. This wasn't something that had been thrown together in anger, or if it had been, someone had cleaned it up. Fossey's already preparing a response, Pat said. Her voice was neutral in a way that meant she was controlling it carefully. He's not going to push back. On the complaint or on me? Pat didn't answer right away, which was an answer. They're not going to fire me over this, Lauren said. It wasn't a question, but it almost was. No, Pat said, but they're going to make it uncomfortable for a while. And Fossey is going to do that thing where he talks about reviewing our policies and improving community relationships in the staff meeting, and everyone's going to know what he means. Lauren handed the tablet back. Okay, she said. That's it? Okay. I'll talk to HR. I'll file my own documentation of what happened this morning. I'll make sure the timeline is clear. She paused. Is there anything else I need to do right now? No, Pat said. Then, are you all right? Lauren thought about that for a second. Not the polite version of thinking, actually thinking. I've been in worse situations, she said, and meant it so completely that it shifted something in Pat's expression. I know you have, Pat said, and the way she said it suggested she maybe knew a little more about Lauren than Lauren had assumed. Lauren went back to work. The crash call came in at 6:47 p.m. Not one crash, a pileup. A section of Route 9 about 12 miles outside town, where the road curved down from the mountains and crossed a patch of black ice that had been there since morning and that, depending on whom you asked later, either had or hadn't been reported to the county road crew. A semi had jackknifed across both lanes. 6 vehicles had been involved. Initial reports from the paramedics on scene put the casualty count at 11, with at least 3 critical. The ER went into mass casualty protocol, which meant the controlled chaos of a place that is rehearsed for this but never quite gets used to it. Bays were cleared, non-urgent patients were moved, staff who'd been scheduled to leave at 7 stayed. Lauren stayed. She didn't have to think about it. The first ambulance arrived at 7:12. A woman in her 30s, unconscious, suspected traumatic brain injury, blood pressure dropping. The second vehicle arrived 4 minutes later with 2 victims, one stable, one with a flail chest that required immediate intervention. Lauren was running between bays, hands always doing something, voice steady and clipped and efficient. She didn't know how much time was passing. That was another thing that happened in mass casualty work. Time became less linear, more like a series of present moments stacked next to each other, each one demanding everything you had. At 7:51, the ambulance bay doors opened again. She heard it before she saw it. The particular quality of a confrontation building, voices from the entrance, the receptionist saying something sharp and then going quiet. She was in Bay 4 starting an arterial line, couldn't leave, but she heard. And then Josie came to the bay entrance, face tight. "He's back," Josie said. Lauren kept her hands where they were. "Mast? He's got another detainee. He's at the desk. Josie stopped. "He's being loud." "Who's at the desk?" "Marcus." Marcus was one of the ER techs, 26, good under pressure but not confrontational by nature. "Tell Marcus to follow protocol," Lauren said, "and get Alcazar if it escalates. Alcazar's in the middle of a chest tube. Then get whoever's closest to an attending." She finished the line, secured it, stepped back. "I'll be right there." She got there in 40 seconds. Mast was standing at the reception desk with a second detainee, this one younger, mid-20s, clearly anxious, a wrapped hand that might have been broken or might have been a sprain. Mast himself was in a different uniform than this morning, which meant he'd been off shift and come back. He'd come back specifically for this. "There she is," he said when he saw Lauren. She walked to the desk. The ER was loud behind her. Monitors, voices, the controlled urgency of a trauma floor at capacity. "Officer Mast, we're currently in mass casualty protocol. We have 11 victims from a highway pileup, 3 of them critical. Your detainee will be triaged and evaluated, but that will take time." "How much time?" "I can't tell you that." "Then I'll wait here." "You're welcome to wait in the—" "Here," he said. "I'll wait right here." She looked at him. He was doing the thing again, that deliberate occupation of space, that studied refusal to move. She understood what he was doing. He was making her the problem. Every minute he stood at that desk, not in the waiting room, he was creating a situation that other people would eventually have to manage. It was a kind of leverage that worked on institutions, on people who needed things to be smooth. It didn't work particularly well on Lauren. "That's fine," she said. "Marcus will check him in. If his condition changes or you believe he's having a medical emergency, flag any staff member immediately." She turned to go. "You filed documentation," Mast said behind her. She stopped, turned back. "I'm sorry?" "With HR. About this morning, you filed documentation." He wasn't asking. He'd found out somehow. Fossey, maybe, or someone in the admin chain who'd mentioned it to the wrong person. "That's standard procedure after a formal complaint," she said. "You want to be real careful," he said, "about the documentation you file." The ER noise continued around them. A monitor alarmed in Bay 2. Somewhere behind her, a doctor called for a second opinion on an X-ray. "Are you threatening me?" she asked. Her voice was exactly the same as it had been for the last 30 seconds. No change in volume, no change in register. "I'm giving you advice." She looked at him for one long moment. "Okay," she said, and she turned and walked back to her patients. The next 2 hours were the worst kind of busy, the kind where you don't have enough hands, and you know it, and you do the best you can anyway. 2 of the critical pileup victims stabilized. 1 didn't. A 55-year-old man named Robert Huang died in Bay 1 at 9:14, despite everything Alcazar and 2 other physicians did. Lauren had been in the room. She'd done compressions. She'd watched the clock and done the math, and kept working past the point where the math said stop, because you kept working until someone told you to stop. Alcazar called it. Quietly, the way he always did. She went to the sink in the supply room, ran cold water over her wrists the way she'd learned helped, and stood there for a minute. Just a minute. Then she dried her hands and went back. Mast was still in the corridor at 9:32 when she came around the corner from the supply room. His detainee had been seen and released 20 minutes ago. He had no reason to still be there. He was talking to Gerald Foss, who was standing with his arms crossed and his suit jacket looking slightly less pressed than it had this morning. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she saw Fossey nod, and she saw him glance in her direction, and she saw the way Mast watched her cross the corridor without making it obvious that he was watching. She went to the nursing station and pulled up the documentation she'd filed with HR at 3 o'clock. She checked the timestamp. She added an addendum noting Mast's return visit during mass casualty protocol, the waiting location dispute, and the comment about being careful with documentation. She saved it and closed the window. At 10:04, Pat Drury came to find her again. Fossey wants to see you tomorrow morning, 7 a.m., before your shift. Lauren didn't say anything for a moment. About? Pat's expression was careful. He called it a preliminary review discussion. Of the Mast complaint. I think so. Yes. Lauren leaned back slightly against the counter. Around her, the floor was finally starting to come down from the mass casualty pace. Quieter, not quiet. The particular exhausted hum of a team that had been at maximum capacity and was now slowly releasing. Okay, she said. Lauren. Pat's voice dropped slightly. I've been doing this for 26 years. What Fossey is doing, that meeting tomorrow, that's not a conversation. That's the beginning of a process. She said it plainly, without softening it, which Lauren appreciated more than she would have appreciated reassurance. I know, Lauren said. Is there anything you need to do tonight? Lauren thought about that. No, she said. I've done what I can do. She clocked out at 10:40, later than she should have been. The parking lot was dark and quiet, just the sodium lights over the ambulance bay and the distant mountain line, dark against a sky that was starting to cloud over. She got to her car, sat in the driver's seat without starting it for a moment. She wasn't scared. That was the thing she kept checking for and not finding. The particular cold stomach feeling she associated with things that could actually hurt her. This wasn't fear. It was something more like recognition. The shape of a situation she'd been in before, in different forms, in different places. The particular machinery of an institution trying to protect itself from something that made it uncomfortable. She'd seen it before. She'd survived it before. She started the car. She was 3 minutes from the hospital when her phone rang. Unknown number, Montana area code. She almost didn't answer it. She answered it. Is this Lauren Voss? A male voice, even, professional, with the kind of precision that didn't come from civilian life. Who's asking? A pause. And then, Sergeant Voss. My name is Colonel James Reardon, Army CID. I'm calling because we've been monitoring a situation at Callaway Regional Medical Center, and I need you to tell me, how bad did it get today? Lauren kept both hands on the wheel and her eyes on the dark road ahead. How did you get this number? She said, and her voice was completely calm because her hands were still steady, and they'd been steady through worse than this, through sand and smoke and choices that couldn't be undone. And whatever was coming next, she was not going to be the one who wasn't ready for it. That's what I'd like to explain, Reardon said, but I need you to pull over first. She pulled over. Not because she had to, not because the voice on the phone had authority over her anymore. She'd been out of the Army for 3 years, and she'd made that separation deliberately and with full understanding of what it meant. She pulled over because the alternative was driving in the dark with her attention split, and she hadn't survived 2 deployments by making avoidable mistakes. She put the car in park on a county road shoulder with the engine running and the heater on low, and she looked at the dashboard while she listened. Talk, she said. Colonel Reardon did not have the manner of someone who was used to explaining himself. He had the manner of someone who was used to being briefed, and the act of being the one delivering information seemed to cost him something, which Lauren found oddly reassuring. Men who were comfortable telling you everything usually didn't have anything worth telling. We became aware of your name in connection with a complaint filed against you at Callaway Regional this afternoon, he said. The complaint came from Officer Derek Mast of the Denton Falls Police Department. I know who filed it. What you may not know is that Officer Mast's name came up in an Army CID investigation 11 months ago. Unrelated matter, or what appeared to be an unrelated matter at the time, A pause. It may be more related than we initially assessed. Lauren stared at the white line on the road shoulder. Her headlights made a short tunnel of light and then nothing. What kind of investigation? I can't go into the specifics over the phone. What I need to know from you is whether you've been contacted by anyone else today. Anyone unusual. Anyone asking questions about your service record. No, she said. Then, why would someone be asking about my service record? Because your service record is not the kind of thing that stays buried when someone starts pulling threads, Reardon said, and Mast, or someone in his orbit, may have started pulling. She sat with that for a moment. I haven't talked to anyone, she said. I filed documentation with HR. I've kept everything inside the institutional channels. Good. Keep it that way for now. Another pause, shorter this time. I need you to go home and not discuss this call with anyone. We'll be in contact tomorrow. You said we, Lauren said. Who's we? But the line was already dead. She sat in the dark for another 2 minutes, listening to the heater and the faint sound of wind against the car, and then she pulled back onto the road and drove home. She didn't sleep particularly well. That wasn't unusual. She lay in the dark with the ceiling above her doing what ceilings do and turned the phone call over in her mind, looking at it from different angles, trying to figure out the shape of it. She couldn't get there from the information she had. That was also not unusual. She'd spent years operating with incomplete information, making decisions in the gaps, and she'd learned that the anxiety of not knowing was something you could either let eat you or learn to sit with like an uncomfortable piece of furniture. She'd gotten reasonably good at the furniture. She was at the hospital by 6:45 the next morning. Fosse's office was on the 3rd floor, administrative wing, the part of the building that smelled like carpet and printer ink instead of antiseptic. The carpet was blue-gray, the kind of institutional color that doesn't offend anyone and doesn't particularly please anyone either. Lauren had been here twice before. Once for her initial onboarding 3 years ago, once for a commendation after a difficult resuscitation case. Both times the office had felt slightly too large for what it was. The kind of space that was meant to communicate authority, but mostly communicated that someone had overestimated the importance of the person who worked there. Fosse was already seated. He had 2 manila folders on the desk and a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking. He also, Lauren noticed, had someone else in the room. A woman she didn't recognize, mid-40s, dark blazer, tablet in hand, introduced as Karen Lyle from the hospital's legal affairs office. Legal affairs. First thing in the morning. Before Lauren's shift had even started. She sat down. Fosse arranged his face into something that was trying to be neutral and landing closer to pained. Lauren, we appreciate you coming in early. We want to be transparent with you about where things stand. Okay, Lauren said. The complaint filed by Officer Mast has been reviewed by our administrative team and by legal affairs. He nodded toward Lyle, who had not made eye contact with Lauren since she sat down. Given the nature of the allegations and given some concerns that have been raised about the interaction in our ER, not just yesterday, but what our team describes as a pattern of conflict with law enforcement personnel. Can you tell me what other incidents you're referring to? Lauren said. Fosse blinked. I'm sorry? You said a pattern of conflict. I'd like to know which specific incidents you're describing. Lyle looked up from her tablet. Fosse glanced at her. There have been concerns raised, he said, informally. From who? That's not really... You're describing a pattern of behavior that doesn't match my understanding of my own conduct, and you're doing it without specifying what the pattern is. I'm asking for specifics. Fosse folded his hands on the desk. This was a thing he did when he was trying to project deliberateness and actually projecting discomfort. Lauren, the reason we're having this meeting is because we've received a formal complaint, backed by a request from the Denton Falls PD for a formal response, and we need to take that seriously. And I filed documentation of my own, Lauren said, time-stamped, with specific details including Mast's statement to me that I should be careful about the documentation I filed. Is that documentation part of what you're reviewing? Lyle's pen moved slightly on her tablet. Fosse cleared his throat. We've seen your documentation. Has it been given the same weight as the complaint? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. What we're asking, Fossey said carefully, is whether you'd be willing to consider a temporary reassignment, just while the review is ongoing, out of the ER, somewhere lower pressure, where you'd have fewer direct interactions with police personnel and the public while this is being resolved. Lauren looked at him. She looked at the two folders on his desk, and at Lyle and her tablet, and at the window behind Fossey that looked out over the hospital's back parking lot, and she thought about Glenda Marsh, who had been septic in Bay 3 yesterday morning while Mast stood at the corridor insisting on being prioritized. She thought about Robert Huang, who hadn't made it out of Bay 1. She thought about the 45 seconds in the supply closet, and the phone call in the dark, and Reardon's voice telling her to keep everything inside institutional channels. "What department?" she said. "Records review? Temporary. 2 to 3 weeks while I'm an ER nurse," she said. "I'm not records review. It's temporary. I understand that." She kept her voice level. "I'm saying that removing me from clinical care during a mass casualty recovery period, in response to a complaint I believe to be retaliatory and unsupported by evidence, is a decision I'd like documented in writing." Lyle's pen stopped moving. "In writing," Fossey repeated. "If I'm being reassigned based on this complaint, I want the reason documented. I want your name on it, and I want it in my personnel file alongside my own account of yesterday's events." She paused. "Is that a problem?" Fossey looked at Lyle. Lyle looked at her tablet with the focused attention of someone reading something very important that was not on the screen. "We'll need to discuss the format of that," Fossey said. "Of course," Lauren said. "I'm happy to wait." She was not, in fact, happy. She was sitting very still and breathing evenly and doing the kind of internal arithmetic that involves tallying what you have against what you need and identifying the gap. She did not have a lawyer. She did not have a union rep, having been told when she started that union representation was available but not particularly necessary for staff at your level. She had her documentation and her timestamps and a phone call from a CID colonel whose number she could not retrieve from her call log because it had come in as unknown. But she had something else too, something that wasn't in any of her files. She had the specific knowledge accumulated over 6 years of clinical work and 4 years of military service before that, of exactly how much pressure a person could take before something broke. And she knew, with some precision, that she was not near that line yet. Fossey said he'd be in touch. She shook Lyle's hand on the way out because she was going to be professional until the moment there was a reason not to be. She went down to the ER and worked her shift. No one reassigned her that day, officially. Whether it was because Fossey needed more time to generate the paperwork or because Lyle had told him something about the liability of documented reassignments in response to police complaints, Lauren didn't know. She showed up, clocked in, and did her job, and the floor accepted her back the way floors accept competent people, not with relief exactly, but with the practical absence of resistance. Josie found her mid-morning. "People are talking," Josie said, which was her way of saying she had heard something and didn't know what to do with it. "About?" "Mast. Someone said he came back again this morning, before you got here. Talked to Fossey." Lauren filed that away without responding to it directly. "How's your patient in 8?" she said. "Better," Josie said. "I think. Check again in an hour." The morning moved. The afternoon moved. Lauren kept expecting something to happen. A page to Fossey's office, a formal notification, some kind of escalation, and nothing did. And the absence of it was its own strange pressure, like waiting for a sound and only getting quiet. At 4:30, Pat Drury fell into step beside her in the corridor. "Walk with me," Pat said. They went to the staff break room, which was empty at that hour. A small room with a microwave that smelled like someone's leftover fish from last Tuesday, and a table with 4 chairs and a window that looked at an air handling unit. Pat closed the door. "I pulled Mast's visits," Pat said. "All of them. Every time he's come through this ER in the last 2 years. Lauren waited. 14 visits in 22 months, 7 different detainees, 3 different incidents where he was a patient himself, 4 times where he just came in. No detainee, no patient status. Just came in. To do what? Unclear. He'd talk to someone in administration sometimes. Other times he'd just walk through. Pat set her phone on the table, showing Lauren a printed out log. But here's the thing. After 3 of those visits, there were complaint filings in the HR system against nurses, different nurses each time, all women, as it happens. Lauren looked at the dates. Were any of them disciplined? One was transferred, one resigned, one had the complaint dismissed but had a performance review that was pointed. Pat picked the phone back up. None of them are here anymore. The break room was quiet. The air handler outside the window hummed with indifferent efficiency. He's been doing this for a while, Lauren said. Longer than 2 years if the pattern holds, but I can only pull our records. Lauren sat down in one of the chairs. It was an uncomfortable chair. Everything in the break room was slightly uncomfortable, as though the hospital wanted to make sure staff didn't linger too long. Why are you showing me this? Pat sat across from her. She looked for a moment older than she usually did. Not tired exactly, but worn in the particular way of people who've been careful for a long time and are considering whether to stop being careful. Because you asked for your reassignment in writing, Pat said, and because I've been watching people not do that for 26 years and watching what happens when they don't. Lauren held her gaze. Is your job at risk? Lauren asked. For showing me this? Probably not. Maybe a little, Pat shrugged. I'm 61. My pension vests in 4 months. If they want to make something of it, they can try. Lauren almost smiled. She didn't quite get there, but she appreciated the gesture that made her almost. She went home that evening with Pat's data in her memory and Reardon's phone call in the back of her mind. And she sat at her kitchen table the way she'd sat the morning before, dark, coffee getting cold. And she thought about the specific nature of the problem. Mast wasn't an angry man who'd had a bad day. He was a pattern. The complaint against her wasn't an isolated overreaction. It was a practiced mechanism, refined over at least 2 years, probably longer, for removing from the ER people who had declined to be useful to him. And Fosse wasn't malicious. He was something worse in some ways. He was convenient. He accepted the complaints, managed the paperwork, and didn't look too hard at what he was participating in because looking hard was more trouble than it was worth. She wrote everything down. Not because she'd been told to, but because she'd learned, in a context where the consequences of poor documentation could be measured in different and more immediate units than HR complaints, that a clear record of what you knew and when you knew it was worth more than almost anything else. She was finishing the document, 3 pages, organized chronologically, every interaction dated and described in clinical language, when her phone rang again. Unknown number. Same Montana area code. Voss, she said. It's Reardon. Are you alone? Yes. Good. I need to ask you something, and I need a straight answer. His voice had the same professional evenness as the night before, but there was something underneath it now, a different quality. Not urgency, exactly. Intention. Your service record has a classified component. You know what I'm referring to. I know what's in my file. Someone ran a query on it this afternoon, not through standard channels, through a back-channel access point that we've been monitoring in connection with the CID investigation I mentioned. Lauren's hand tightened slightly on the phone. Someone ran a query on my classified record. A search was initiated, the full record was not accessed, the access controls held, but the query was logged and it originated from an IP address we're tracing. Connected to Mast. We don't know yet. We're working on it. A pause. Sergeant Voss, Lauren. I need to know how much of your background is known to anyone at that hospital. Anyone at all. She thought about Pat's comment, the way she'd said, I know you have, when Lauren had said she'd been in worse situations. The way it had landed, not like a guess, more like confirmation of something. My supervisor may have an idea, Lauren said carefully. Nothing specific. She's been around long enough to read people. Anyone else? No. Keep it that way. The line was quiet for a second. We're moving faster than I expected on this. If the query on your record is connected to Mast, that changes the nature of what we're looking at. That's not a local police officer filing a nuisance complaint anymore. What is it? He didn't answer that directly. He said, don't go to that meeting with Fosse if they reschedule it tomorrow. Call in sick if you have to. I'm not going to call in sick, Lauren said. Lauren, I have patience. I'm not calling in sick. She paused. But I'll be careful. Another pause from his end, longer this time. There's one more thing, Reardon said, and I need you to listen without reacting. All right. There's a second individual we've had under surveillance, connected to Mast, connected to the query on your file. His name is Walter Creed. Walt Creed, Mast's sergeant, the man who had countersigned the formal complaint. What about him? Lauren said. He's been making calls, Reardon said, in the last 18 hours. Several of them to a number we've connected to a federal contractor whose security clearance has been under review for activities we can't discuss in full. But what I can tell you is that someone is trying to find out who you are, the full picture of who you are, and they're trying to find out fast. Lauren sat at her kitchen table in the dark with the document open in front of her and listened to the refrigerator hum and thought about the shape of a thing that had started as one angry police officer refusing to wait his turn and had somehow become this. Why? She said. Why would Mast care enough about a nurse he got into an argument with to start pulling strings like this? That, Reardon said, is exactly the right question. He hung up. She stared at the phone for a moment. Then she saved her document, closed her laptop, and was standing up from the table when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Different from the one Reardon used, a 406 prefix she didn't recognize. One line, no signature. He knows you filed the documentation, Fossey told him. Be careful tomorrow. She looked at the text for a long time. She didn't know who had sent it. Someone inside the hospital who'd seen something they weren't supposed to see, maybe. Or something else entirely. There was no way to know from a text. She put the phone face down on the table and stood in her kitchen with her hands flat on the counter, feeling the cold of the laminate under her palms. Outside the window, the mountains were invisible. Cloud cover, no moon, just the faint ambient glow of the city reflecting back off the low ceiling. She needed to sleep. She was working a 6 a.m. shift and she needed to sleep. She went to bed. She lay in the dark. She did not sleep for a long time. And when she did, she dreamed of nothing she could remember afterward, just the sensation of being in a very small space, completely still, waiting for a door to open from the other side. At 5:15 a.m., the door opened. Not metaphorically, literally, her front door. 3 rapid knocks, the kind that are designed to wake you up without being mistakable for something casual. She was out of bed before she was fully conscious, and she was standing at the door, not opening it, standing to the side of it the way she'd trained herself to stand near doors in other contexts, in other years, in places where what was on the other side of a door was not always knowable or safe, before she'd fully processed being awake. Lauren Voss, a voice said through the door. Army CID, Colonel Reardon, I have identification. She opened the door. Reardon was shorter than she'd imagined from his voice. 5'10" maybe, with the kind of physical economy that comes from years of operational work. He was in civilian clothes, not uniform, and he had a badge case open in his left hand and a second man standing slightly behind him, also civilian, who didn't introduce himself and who Lauren immediately understood was not going to. What happened? She said. Reardon stepped inside when she moved back to let him. The second man stayed in the doorway. At 11:40 p.m. last night, Reardon said, someone accessed the administrative record system at Callaway Regional Medical Center remotely. They pulled 2 files, yours and a second file we weren't expecting. What second file? Your patient, he said. Glenda Marsh. Lauren stared at him. Why would anyone pull Glenda Marsh's file? Reardon's expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A subtle shift, the kind you learn to read when you've spent time around people who control their faces for a living. Because 12 years ago, he said, before she was a patient in your ER, Glenda Marsh was a forensic accountant for the state attorney general's office. And the case she was working before she left, the case that ended her career, that she was told to stop pursuing, that made her very quietly leave that job and move to Denton Falls and become someone's wife and just live her life. He paused. The lead officer named in the misconduct allegations at the center of that case was a 29-year-old patrol officer named Derek Mast. The kitchen was very still. Lauren felt the specific sensation she associated with the moment before something changed. Not fear, not excitement, something older and more precise than either. He knew she was here, she said. He's known for months, Reardon said. We think he's been watching her, and we think yesterday. When you kept him out of the ER, when you documented everything, when you filed with HR, he got scared that she'd been moved to a room he couldn't access, that someone with a military background he couldn't account for was between him and a woman who could still, if she recovered her health and chose to come forward, put him away for what he did a long time ago. Lauren thought about Glenda Marsh, mottled skin and slow responses. Her husband in the waiting room not knowing enough to be as scared as he should have been. She thought about what Reardon had just said. 12 years. Is she safe? Lauren said. Right now. Is she still in the hospital? Is she safe? Reardon looked at her steadily. That's why we're here at 5 in the morning, he said. We need you to come with us. She grabbed her jacket off the hook by the door. She didn't ask for more information. Didn't ask Reardon to come inside and sit down and walk her through it slowly. She'd been in enough situations where the explanation could happen in motion to know that when someone showed up at your door at 5 in the morning and said, we need you to come with us, the explanation was secondary to the moving. The second man, still unnamed, still in the doorway, stepped aside to let her pass. Reardon fell into step beside her. The street outside was dark and cold, the kind of February cold that had teeth, and there were 2 vehicles at the curb, both dark, both unremarkable, the kind of vehicles that were designed to be forgotten. 4 men total, counting the 2 flanking the cars, all civilian clothes, all carrying themselves the same way, with the same precise economy of movement that she recognized from years of working alongside people who'd had it trained into them until it stopped being conscious. She got in the first vehicle without being asked which one. Reardon got in beside her. The unnamed man took the front passenger seat. They moved immediately. Her room, Lauren said. She's been in the ICU since yesterday afternoon. What floor is she on? 4th, Reardon said. We have people there. What kind of people? The kind that don't wear badges where you can see them. That was something, at least. Lauren watched the city come past the window, still dark, mostly empty, the streets carrying the particular silence of a place that hasn't started yet. A traffic light changed from green to yellow to red to green again for no one. What happened to the remote access, she said, when they pulled her file? We flagged it. The access was from an external device routed through a VPN that we've seen used in 2 prior incidents connected to Mast's network. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, but not well enough. Reardon's voice was steady, factual. He was not someone who inflated information with drama. She appreciated that. We don't believe they found what they were looking for. Her records show admission status and current medication list, not her case history or prior employment. But they know she's there. They already knew. The file access was confirmation of something, not discovery of something new. Lauren thought about that. A man who'd been watching Glenda Marsh for months, who'd known she was in Denton Falls, living quietly, married, not making noise. And then Mast had walked into the ER 2 days ago and found a nurse who wouldn't move, who documented everything, who stood directly between him and a floor he needed access to. She thought about the way he'd looked at her. Not the anger, specifically, but what was underneath it, the calculation. She'd read it at the time as ego, as the particular resentment of a powerful man being refused by someone he considered beneath him. But it had been something else too, something she hadn't had the context to name. Fear. He'd been afraid of her before he even knew who she was, because she was competent, and she was documenting things, and she was in his way. The hospital came into view. The parking structure first, then the main building, its upper floors lit against the dark sky. The ambulance bay was quiet. No vehicles outside. No activity. That would change in an hour. They went in through a side entrance Lauren didn't typically use, a staff access door near the loading dock that required a key card. The man in front had one. She didn't ask how. The ICU was on the 4th floor. The elevator was slow. No one spoke on the ride up. The floor was dim, the way hospital floors are dim at this hour. The particular half-light of a place that never fully goes dark, where the nurses worked under task lighting and the overhead fluorescents were turned down to something approximating human mercy. Lauren knew this floor. She'd sent patients up here, had followed up on cases. had once spent 40 minutes in the family waiting room explaining a diagnosis to a man who couldn't stop asking the same question 3 different ways because he wasn't ready for the answer. There were 2 men she didn't recognize standing casually near the nursing station, positioned in the way that people who are trying not to look like they're positioned do it badly enough that anyone trained to notice would notice. The floor nurse on duty, a man named Terry, Lauren recognized him, glanced at Lauren when she came through, and his expression went from surprised to careful in about half a second. "She's stable," Terry said immediately, before Lauren could ask. "Pressure's been steady since about 2 a.m. She's responding better to the antibiotics." "Good," Lauren said. "Is her husband here?" "Waiting room. He hasn't left." Lauren looked at Reardon. Something passed between them that wasn't quite a conversation. "I need 5 minutes," she said. "You have 3, he said. She went to the room. Glenda Marsh looked smaller in the ICU bed than she had in the ER bay, which was a function of the room being quieter and having fewer people in it, and the equipment around her being more permanent-looking, less emergency, and more long-term management. She was asleep, genuinely asleep, not sedated, her breathing slow and even. The monitor beside her showed vital signs that were, if not good, considerably better than they'd been 36 hours ago. Lauren stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. She wasn't sure exactly what she was doing here. She told Reardon she needed 5 minutes, but she hadn't had a reason formed yet when she said it. She'd just known she needed to be in this room. Looking at Glenda Marsh sleeping, Lauren thought, 12 years. This woman had found something 12 years ago and had her career taken away because of it, and had moved across the state and made herself small and lived quietly and still, somehow hadn't been far enough, hadn't been forgettable enough. There was something enraging about that Lauren didn't have words for. Not on Glenda Marsh's behalf specifically. She didn't know her. She was a patient, a face and a chart and a series of vital signs. But on behalf of the general principle that some people spent their lives shrinking to avoid men like Mast, and it still wasn't enough. She touched the bed rail lightly. Not Glenda's hand. She didn't want to wake her, just the rail. Then she went back out. Reardon was waiting outside the room. "What's the plan?" Lauren said. "We're moving her," he said, "this morning, before the hospital comes fully staffed and active. We have authorization from the State Attorney General's office. There's a federal protection angle given the nature of the underlying investigation, and A.G. Holloway's team has been read in as of 2 hours ago." He said all of this the way people say things they've been saying since before you got there, the summary version of a longer conversation. Protective custody, undisclosed location. Her husband's being briefed right now. "Who's briefing him?" "One of my people." "Does he know why?" "He knows enough." Reardon looked at her. "There's something else." She waited. "Mast filed a second complaint this morning. Overnight, actually. It's time-stamped at 12:40 a.m. His expression remained completely level. "This one isn't a workplace conduct complaint. He's alleging that you accessed restricted police department databases without authorization and interfered with an active investigation." Lauren stared at him. "That's fabricated," she said. We know that." "He's trying to flip it. He's trying to make me the—" "We know," Reardon said, and his voice was steady enough that she caught herself and stopped. Not because he'd asked her to, but because he was right that she didn't need to explain it to him. He already understood. "He's doing it because he's scared and he's escalating, and that is actually useful to us. Because a man who's filing false police complaints at 12:40 in the morning is a man who is not thinking carefully. What happens when the hospital gets that complaint? Fossey will receive it at some point this morning. He'll probably ask you to leave the building." Lauren was quiet for a moment. "And if he does?" "Then you leave," Reardon said. "And then you let us do what we came here to do." She didn't like it. She could feel the shape of not liking it, the specific friction of being asked to stand back from something she was already inside of. She'd spent 2 days doing everything right, every step documented, every interaction handled professionally, and the result was a fabricated complaint with her name on it and a request to clear the building. "My patients," she said, will be cared for by the staff on duty. Josie has a patient in 8 she's been tracking who I don't think she—" "Lauren," his voice was not unkind, "I need you to trust me on the timing of this. Can you do that?" She looked at him. He was asking her to assess him, not on reputation or rank, both of which meant considerably less to her out here than they would have in a different context, but on the specific quality of his competence as observable in the last few hours. She ran that assessment and it came back marginally positive. He wasn't perfect. He'd shown up at her door later than ideal, which meant something in their timeline had slipped. But he was here, and he was moving, and he wasn't asking her to do something that felt false. "Okay," she said. "Good." He glanced at his watch. "We move Marsh in 40 minutes. I need you to go down to the ER, clock in, give handoffs if you have anything critical. When Fossey comes to you, and he will come to you, keep it professional. Don't argue, don't give him anything else to document, just leave. And then come to this address." He handed her a card. It had a street address and nothing else. No name, no number. She looked at it. "Is this where you're taking Marsh?" "No, it's where I need you." She put the card in her jacket pocket and went to the elevator. The ER at 5:50 a.m. was in the specific state of a night shift finishing. Not quiet, never quiet, but slower. The pace of a team that had been going since midnight and was starting to feel it in their feet and lower backs, and the particular blur around the edges of their vision. Lauren clocked in, found the night charge nurse finishing a handoff, got a quick summary of the board. Josie had already come in early. She was in Bay 8 when Lauren found her, adjusting a drip rate with the careful attention of someone who knows they're being watched, even when no one's watching. "I was going to page you," Josie said. "I'm here." Lauren looked at the patient, a 60-year-old man, post-operative, who'd been flagged for a possible developing infection. She checked the site, checked the temp, looked at the last 2 hours of vitals. "You've been watching the trend? Every 30 minutes, it's creeping up." "Good catch. Call Alcazar when he comes in at 6:30. Show him this specifically." She pointed to a number on the chart. "He'll want to know about the trajectory, not just the current value." "Okay." Josie was watching her. "Are you okay?" "Yes," Lauren said, because that was the only useful answer. She went back to the floor. At 6:17, Gerald Fossey came through the ER entrance. He was not in a suit today. He was wearing a button-down and khakis, like he'd come from home in a hurry, and he had his phone in his hand, which he was looking at even as he walked. He found Lauren at the nursing station. She saw him coming. "Lauren," he said, and his voice was doing the pain-neutral thing again, but more so this time, more strained. The situation was costing him more than yesterday's had. "I need to speak with you." "Okay?" He glanced at the tech at the station, who took the hint and found something to do elsewhere. "We've received—" He stopped, started again. "The Denton Falls PD has filed an additional complaint this morning. This one has been forwarded to our compliance team and also to hospital counsel, and given the severity of the allegation, that I accessed restricted police databases without authorization," Lauren said. Fossey's expression shifted. He hadn't expected her to already know. "Yes." "I didn't do that," she said. "That allegation is false." "I understand you believe that. It's not a question of what I believe. It's factually false, and there are people who can confirm that." She kept her voice even. "Is the hospital suspending me?" The word landed wrong on him. He didn't like suspending. It had legal weight. "We're asking you to take administrative leave pending—" "Is it paid?" A pause. "Yes." "Is it formally documented as administrative leave pending review, or is it documented some other way?" "Lauren, I need to know how it's being documented, Gerald." First time she'd used his first name. She watched him process that. "Because the nature of the documentation affects what I need to do next in terms of protecting myself." Fossey looked at his phone, then at the floor, then at her. "Paid administrative leave pending review of the complaint," he said. "That's how it's documented." "Thank you." She took her badge off her scrubs. She held it for a moment. Just a moment. Not for drama, but because she'd worn it for 3 years and the weight of it was familiar in a way she hadn't thought about until right now. She put it on the counter. "I'll need a copy of the documentation before end of business today." "Of course." "Is there anything else?" He shook his head. He looked like a man who'd been asked to do something he understood was wrong and had done it anyway, which was its own category of person. Not malicious, not brave, just compliant enough with the path of least resistance to end up complicit. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair at the station. She stopped at Bay 8 on the way out, looked in to confirm Josie was still with her patient. She didn't say anything to Josie. She just looked, made sure, and kept moving. Outside, the morning had started. The parking lot was gray with early light, frost still on the cars in the far rows. Her breath came out white. She walked to where she'd parked, got in, and sat for a moment with the address card in her hand. She entered the address into her phone's map. A warehouse district on the east side of Denton Falls, a neighborhood she knew mostly from driving through it on the way to somewhere else. 12 minutes. She pulled out of the lot. She was 4 blocks from the hospital when she saw the police cruiser. It was parked on a side street that she wouldn't normally take, but she'd gone right instead of left out of the lot because the main street had been slower at this hour. The cruiser was running, which was normal. What was not normal was that it pulled out behind her almost immediately after she passed it. Not with lights, not with sirens, just followed. She watched it in the rear view. She made a turn. It made the same turn. She made a second turn, adding a block to her route for no reason a casual observer would have. It followed. Derek Mast wasn't in the car. She couldn't see the driver clearly enough to know that, but she knew it in the way you know some things. He was the kind of person who didn't do his own following. He had people. She kept her speed exactly at the limit. She kept both hands on the wheel. She thought about the card in her pocket and the address on it and the 12 minutes that had now become, because of the detour she'd just taken, more like 15, and she thought about Reardon telling her to trust his timing. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it without taking her eyes off the road. "You've got a tail," said a voice she didn't recognize. Not Reardon. Younger. Clipped. "I noticed," she said. "Don't go to the address yet. Take the on-ramp for Route 12 North. Get on the highway." "Who is this?" "Someone who'd like to see you arrive in one piece." A pause. "Reardon's tied up. He'll meet you. Take the highway." She looked in the rear view. The cruiser was 2 cars back. She had about 90 seconds before the Route 12 on-ramp, and a choice she needed to make before then. Take the highway based on an instruction from an unknown voice, or continue to the address on the card, with a car behind her that she didn't want anywhere near wherever Reardon had set up. She took the on-ramp. Route 12 North climbed out of the valley, and the city fell away behind her in the gray morning light, and the cruiser came up the ramp behind her, and ahead the mountains were starting to show their tops over the horizon, still snow-covered, pale against a sky the color of old paper. Her phone buzzed. A text from the same unknown number. 3 words. "Pull over. Now." Not on the highway. She wasn't doing that. But there was a rest area a mile ahead. She'd passed it 100 times. A pull-off with a picnic table and a trash can and a view of the valley below. She moved into the right lane. The cruiser moved with her. She pulled into the rest area. The cruiser pulled in behind her, blocking the exit, and then 2 more vehicles came from the other direction, from the north, coming down the mountain. And they were black and unmarked, and they moved with the particular deliberate precision of vehicles that know exactly where they're going and exactly when they need to arrive. The cruiser didn't move. Lauren sat in her car and watched all 3 vehicles in her mirrors, and then she looked at her hands on the steering wheel because she'd learned a long time ago that the information your hands gave you was more honest than what your brain was trying to tell you. Her hands were steady. And then the cruiser's door opened, and Officer Derek Mast stepped out onto the gravel, and he was looking directly at her car, and he wasn't in uniform. Civilian clothes, jacket, his badge clipped at his belt the way off-duty officers sometimes did it. And he started walking toward her. She didn't get out. She watched him come. 7 steps, 6, 5, and then the doors of the 2 black vehicles opened, and 8 people stepped out, and the last one, the one who came from the rear vehicle, who walked with the kind of unhurried certainty that doesn't need to hurry because it has already won, was not Reardon. It was a woman Lauren didn't recognize. Mid-50s, gray at her temples, a bearing so controlled it barely moved when she walked. She was in a dark coat, no visible identification, and she held something out in front of her that caught the morning light. A federal badge. Derek Mast stopped walking. He stood 4 feet from Lauren's car door, and he looked at the badge, and something happened in his face. A kind of collapse. Very controlled, very fast, like a building whose supports have just been cut but hasn't started falling yet. Lauren watched it. She watched him understand in real time what was happening, what had already happened, how far back it had already happened, before he'd ever filed a complaint, before he'd ever walked into the ER and put his hands on someone he thought didn't matter. She watched him realize he'd been followed the whole time. And then the woman with the badge spoke, clearly, into the morning air. And what she said were not words Lauren had expected. And the blood in her veins went cold, and then hot, and then steady again, because she heard her own name in what the woman said, and a rank, sergeant, that Lauren hadn't been called in 3 years, and a description of what she was, what she had been, what her sealed records contained, spoken aloud in a rest area on a mountain highway as the sun came up and the valley spread out below them like something that didn't know what was happening above it. Mast turned and looked at Lauren's car. He finally understood who he'd put his hands on, and from the expression on his face, that understanding was not a relief. Lauren got out of the car. Not because anyone told her to, because sitting in the driver's seat while everything happened around her was not something she was willing to do, and the particular quality of the morning, cold, clear, the valley below them just beginning to catch color, felt like the kind of moment you were supposed to be standing up for. She stood at the car door and watched. The woman with the federal badge had not moved. She was positioned between Mast and the vehicles behind her with the ease of someone who had placed herself exactly where she intended to be, and the 8 people who'd come out of the 2 dark vehicles had spread into positions that weren't obvious until you looked for them, and then they were obvious. Lauren looked for them. She found all 8 in about 4 seconds. Mast had stopped walking entirely. He was standing on his gravel with one hand slightly away from his body. Not reaching, not threatening, just the unconscious physical grammar of a man whose options had just contracted severely and whose nervous system was trying to catch up with the math. Derek Allen Mast. The woman's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. The morning was still enough that it carried cleanly. Special Agent Diane Corver, FBI Field Operations. You are under federal investigation for obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, unauthorized access to protected federal records, and conspiracy to interfere with a protected individual under federal supervision. She paused, just briefly. You have the right to remain silent. Mast said nothing for a moment, and then, this is a mistake. Corver looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has heard this specific sentence so many times it no longer registers as language. It isn't, she said. 2 of the 8 moved in. Mast didn't resist. He was a professional, whatever else he was, and he understood what resistance looked like in this context and what it would cost him. He put his hands behind his back when he was asked to. The cuffs were applied with no drama, no commentary, just the sound of the mechanism, which was very small in the open air. Reardon appeared from the second vehicle. He walked over to Lauren, hands in his jacket pockets, looking slightly more tired than he had at her door an hour ago, but otherwise the same, that same measured quality, like someone who'd been operating on short sleep and compressed timelines for long enough that it had become his baseline. You took the highway, he said. Someone told me to. That was Reyes. He nodded toward one of the 8, who was now on a radio near the tree line. He was watching the ER lot, flagged the tail. Lauren watched them put Mast in one of the vehicles. He turned his head as the door was closing and looked at her one more time, and she held it, and she didn't look away until the door shut and the window was between them and his expression became unreadable through the glass. Corver, she said, FBI. She's been running the federal piece. My investigation ran parallel. The classified records access brought CID in, but this was always going to land in Corver's jurisdiction. Reardon paused. She's good. Methodical. This arrest isn't the end of what she's building. Walt Creed, Lauren said, already picked up about 20 minutes ago. He looked at his watch in a way that suggested he'd been tracking multiple moving pieces and was doing a quick inventory. Fossey wasn't part of it, Lauren said. He was just convenient, we know. Reardon glanced at her. He cooperated when Corver's team contacted him at 5:45 this morning, provided everything he had without being asked twice. He's not facing charges. Lauren thought about that. She wasn't sure if she was relieved or not. Fossey had been a problem, but his being a problem had been a function of weakness rather than malice, and she'd spent enough time around genuinely malicious people to know the difference. "My administrative leave," she said, "will be rescinded today. Corver will be speaking with hospital counsel before noon." He paused again. "Lauren, your record," the classified portion. "It became part of the federal filing this morning. Not public, but known to the relevant parties. Which means that in the next several hours, a number of people are going to be adjusting their understanding of the last 2 days significantly." She understood what he was saying. She wasn't sure how she felt about it. "I didn't want it known," she said. "I know." His voice was straightforward, not apologetic. "That choice was taken off the table when someone went looking for it." She looked out at the valley. The light was coming up properly now, the mountains going from dark to bright in the way that happened fast up here, faster than you expected, the snow catching the sun before the ground did. "How long have you been building this?" she said. "Corver's team has been on it for 8 months. My piece came in 3 months ago when the classified database query was logged." He paused. "You were the piece we didn't plan for. When Mast filed the complaint against you and we ran your record in connection with the investigation, we realized he'd put himself directly in contact with someone he had no way to anticipate." "Lucky for you," she said, and she meant it neutrally, not bitterly, because it was what it was. "Lucky for Glenda Marsh," Reardon said, and that landed differently. The next 6 hours were the kind that happened mostly in rooms. Lauren had been in enough debrief settings to know the basic grammar of them. The table, the water in the middle that nobody drank, the way questions were asked, not because the person asking didn't know the answer, but to establish a clean record of having asked. She gave her account of the last 2 days 3 times, to 3 different people, with a level of precision that surprised even her in retrospect. She'd always had a strong memory for sequential detail, a useful thing in clinical work where the order of events mattered enormously, and she gave them everything in order, with timestamps where she had them, and approximations where she didn't. Corver sat in on the second session. She didn't run it herself. She let a younger agent named Samuels do that while she sat to the side with a legal pad and didn't write much. Lauren got the impression that Corver was doing what Corver did, watching, filing, adding to a picture she'd been building for 8 months. At the end of the second session, Corver spoke directly to Lauren for the first time. "The complaint Mast filed against you this morning, the one alleging unauthorized database access," she said. "He filed it from his personal phone at 12:40 a.m. using a template document that was prepared 2 days ago. Before the complaint, he filed at your hospital, before he'd even met you." Lauren looked at her. "The template was prepared for someone else," Corver continued. "A detective in the Denton Falls PD named Raina Souza, who had been looking into Mast's conduct record internally. Sousa was moved to a desk assignment 6 weeks ago following a complaint filed against her. Same mechanism, different target." "He had it ready," Lauren said, "for whoever got in his way. He had 4 of them ready. Different names, different allegations, same structure." Corver looked at her legal pad. "You weren't the intended target. You were just the person who happened to be in the ER when he needed something and wouldn't move." The room was quiet for a moment. "How many people did he do this to?" Lauren said. Corver looked at her steadily. "We've identified 9 confirmed cases over 7 years. 6 nurses, 2 administrative staff, 1 paramedic. Some resigned, some were transferred. 1 was suspended for 3 months before the charge was eventually dismissed. She'd already left the profession by then." She paused. "There are likely more we haven't confirmed yet." Lauren thought about Pat Drury's log. The 14 visits in 22 months, the women who weren't there anymore. "Glenda Marsh," she said, "is stable. She was moved to a secure facility at 6:15 this morning. She and her husband were briefed fully." Corver's voice remained professional, which was the right call. "She's asked to cooperate with the investigation. Given her background and the specificity of what she knows, her testimony is going to be significant." 12 years she's been living with that," Lauren said. "Yes," Corver said, and left it there, because there was nothing useful to add. Lauren left the federal building, a nondescript office space in a commercial district that she'd been taken to without knowing the address, and still didn't know the address of, at a little past noon. Reardon drove her back to her car, still at the rest area on Route 12, which felt surreal in the way that things always felt surreal when you return to a location after the circumstances had changed completely. Her car was there. The gravel was scuffed where the vehicles had been. There was nothing else. No tape, no markers. Just the ordinary rest area with its picnic table and its trash can and its view of a valley going about its business below. She drove back into Denton Falls. She didn't go home. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Not because she had somewhere to be, but because going home felt like the wrong sequence. She drove to the hospital instead, parked in the far lot the way she always did, and went in through the main entrance rather than the staff entrance because she didn't have her badge, and she wasn't on duty. Pat Drury was in the ER. She was at the nursing station when Lauren came through, and she looked up and her face did the thing that faces do when they're trying to decide how much to show. "You look terrible," Pat said, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to her in hours. "I haven't slept," Lauren said. "I know what happened," Pat said. "Or part of it. The hospital got a call from some federal counsel this morning, and Fossey spent about 2 hours in his office with the door closed and then sent around a staff email about ongoing HR matters being resolved. Very informative. My leave is being rescinded." That's what the email implied. Pat studied her. "Are you all right?" Lauren had been asked this question in various forms, approximately 7 times in the last 6 hours, and she'd given the same approximately useful answer each time. She considered Pat and decided to be more honest. "Not entirely," she said. "I'm functional, but I'm not all right." Pat nodded like that was acceptable. "Josie's patient in 8, Lauren said. Alcazar saw him at 7:15, switched the antibiotic, doing better." "Good." Lauren leaned against the counter for a moment. "The women Mast drove out, the ones in your log. I know. Is there any of it that can be reversed? Some of them? If the complaint history is part of the federal case, if it gets expunged?" "I don't know," Pat said. "I don't know enough about how that works." She paused. "But I think some of them may want to know about it. If there's a process, if there's someone they could call." "I'll find out," Lauren said. She meant it. She didn't know exactly what it would look like yet, but she meant it. The story broke publicly that evening, not through the federal investigation, which was sealed pending ongoing proceedings, through a body camera. Officer Pitt, the younger officer who'd been with Mast the first morning, the one who'd stood against the wall looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, had been wearing a body camera during the initial ER visit. He had not turned it off. The footage had been sitting in the department's storage system for 2 days, logged automatically the way all body camera footage was logged, and when Corver's team subpoenaed the department's records as part of the broader investigation, the footage came with everything else. It showed Mast at the ER reception desk. It showed the exchange with Lauren, word for word, the way she'd described it, the way she'd documented it. It showed him in the corridor, not the waiting room, watching her work. It showed the specific moment he told her to be careful about her documentation, and it showed her response, which was nothing, which was turning and walking away, which was the absence of the confrontation he'd been trying to create. And then it showed something Lauren hadn't known was captured. At 7:44 p.m., during the mass casualty response, while Lauren was in Bay 4, Mast had approached a person Lauren didn't recognize, a man in civilian clothes who'd been in the waiting room. 17 seconds of conversation. The man's face was partially obscured but identifiable to anyone who had reason to know who he was. And Corver's team had reason to know who he was. He was a contractor connected to the security firm that had made the unauthorized query on Lauren's classified file. 17 seconds in a hospital waiting room during a mass casualty event, and those 17 seconds were the thread that connected a local police officer's petty harassment to a network that was considerably larger and less local than anyone had publicly indicated. The footage was released through channels Lauren didn't fully understand and didn't need to. She learned about it from her phone at 7:30 in the evening, sitting at her kitchen table with food she'd reheated and mostly not eaten. Her sister texted her a news link. "Is this the hospital you work at?" Lauren replied yes and put her phone face down. By 9 p.m., the footage had been viewed over 400,000 times. By midnight, it was national. She slept that night. Not well, but she slept. She dreamed something she couldn't remember, and she woke up at 4:15 as she always did, and she lay in the dark for a while thinking about the shape of what had happened. The thing about a situation like this, and she'd thought about it in the federal building, between the second and third session, in the bathroom where she'd stood at the sink and run cold water over her wrists and looked at herself in the mirror with the honesty she only managed when she was alone. The thing about it was that it hadn't changed who she was. She was the same person she'd been at the start of the Monday shift, the same person who'd gotten to work early and parked in the far lot and held the door for the paramedics. She was the same person who'd been a combat medic in places she still didn't talk about, who'd made decisions in the field that she'd carry forever, who'd come home and tried to find a way to keep being useful in a context that didn't require the other thing. The world had found out about the other thing. She hadn't consented to that. She was still deciding how to feel about it, but she also knew, in the specific, unromantic way she knew most things, that it didn't matter much whether she was comfortable with it. It was out. And the question now was what she did with the space that opened up on the other side. She got up at 5, made coffee, sat at the table. Her phone was on the table with the screen down. She turned it over and looked at the notifications, 47 of them since midnight, from numbers she didn't recognize, from news outlets, from people she'd worked with years ago in places she hadn't thought about in months. One from a number she recognized as Pat Drury's personal cell. Call me when you wake up. Not urgent, just call me. She called Pat at 5:20. The detective, Pat said, without preamble. Raina Sousa, the one who'd been investigating Mast internally before she got pulled off and moved to a desk. Corver mentioned her, Lauren said. She called the hospital this morning. Before 6 a.m., I was already in. She saw the footage last night, and she called the main ER line because she didn't know how else to reach someone. Pat paused. She's been sitting on documentation of her own for 6 weeks. Everything she found before they pulled her off the internal investigation. She's been afraid to do anything with it. She's not afraid now? Lauren said. She said, and I'm quoting this because it's worth quoting, she said, if a nurse did it in public, I can do it in writing. Pat was quiet for a moment. She wants to talk to whoever Lauren Voss talks to. Lauren looked at the kitchen ceiling. Outside, the sky was doing the pre-dawn thing, the very first gray at the edges. I'll get her Corver's number, she said. She spent the rest of the morning on the phone. Corver. Then Reardon, briefly, to coordinate. Then the hospital's HR department, where she spoke to someone above Fosse's level for the first time, a regional director named Anita Park, who had clearly been on 2 calls before this one and had the tone of someone who was managing a situation they hadn't been briefed about quickly enough. Lauren was precise and professional and gave Park the same information she'd given everyone else, the same sequence, the same timestamps. At 10 a.m., Park called back. Your leave has been formally rescinded, Park said, effective immediately. All documentation connected to the Mast complaint is being reviewed for removal from your personnel file. A pause. The hospital would also like to meet with you at your convenience to discuss your return and to express our understanding of what happened. Express our understanding. Lauren noted the phrasing. I'll be in tomorrow, she said. I'm scheduled for a 6 a.m. shift. Another pause, slightly longer this time. That's fine, Park said. Of course. Is there anything else? Dr. Alcazar asked me to pass along that he hopes you're okay. Park's voice shifted very slightly. I think there are a lot of people there who hope you're okay. Lauren was quiet for a moment. Tell him Glenda Marsh is doing better, she said. He'll know what that means. She hung up and sat with the phone for a moment. The day had a weight to it that wasn't entirely bad. Complicated, maybe. She was being given things back, her badge, her floor, her professional record, and she was aware that the giving back was still people giving her things rather than having never taken them. And there was something in her that hadn't quite metabolized that yet. Something that wasn't resentment so much as a clear-eyed recognition that the machinery worked the way it worked, even when the machinery was wrong. She went for a walk at noon, just around the neighborhood, no destination, the way she sometimes did when she needed to let her brain run down like a motor. The temperature had risen enough to take the edge off the cold, and there was snowmelt running in the gutters, and a dog behind a fence somewhere barked twice and stopped, And it was the kind of ordinary afternoon that felt almost aggressive in its ordinariness after the last 50 hours. At 2:17, her phone rang. Unknown number, different area code than before. She almost didn't answer. She answered. Lauren Voss. A woman's voice, unhurried, professional. Not Corver. Someone else entirely. My name is Dr. Harriet Sands. I'm the director of the Joint Medical Interagency Training Program at Fort Carson. I'm calling because I've been made aware of your service record and your current professional circumstances, and I'd like to talk to you about something, if you have time. Lauren stopped walking. How did you get this number? She said. She'd asked that question before. She was getting more practiced at asking it. Colonel Reardon provided it, Sands said. With your record having been entered into federal proceedings, there are people who've been looking at it who had reason to contact me. I want to be clear that I'm not calling in any official capacity, and there's no obligation of any kind. A pause. But I've been looking for someone with your specific combination of clinical and operational background for about 7 months, and I'd like to at least have a conversation. Lauren stood on the sidewalk with a strip of snowmelt running past her boots. What kind of program? She said. We train joint military-civilian trauma teams for mass casualty response in austere environments. The instructors need both sides of the equation, field experience and clinical depth. We've had the clinical depth. We've struggled with the field side. Another pause, brief and deliberate. We've also had difficulty retaining people who are comfortable operating in institutional environments without becoming entirely defined by the institutional hierarchy. Lauren heard what wasn't said in that sentence. You're looking for someone who knows when not to follow orders, she said. I'm looking for someone who knows which orders not to follow, Sands said, which is different. The afternoon was quiet around her. A car passed. Somewhere down the block, someone's door opened and closed. I'm not leaving my patients, Lauren said. I'm not asking you to. We're talking about an expanded role. I'd want to explain the specifics in more detail than a phone call allows. A pause. Would you be willing to meet? Lauren thought about tomorrow morning's 6 a.m. shift. She thought about Bay 8 and Josie and Alcazar. She thought about the women in Pat Drury's log, the ones who weren't there anymore, the ones who'd had something taken from them and hadn't had it given back yet. Yes, she said. I'll meet. Good. Sands' voice had a quality that wasn't quite warm and wasn't quite cold and was very specifically focused. One more thing, and I hope you'll take this the way it's meant. What you did in that ER, refusing to be moved, documenting everything, staying professional under conditions designed to make you unprofessional, that wasn't incidental to what I'm calling about. That's exactly it. Lauren said nothing. That kind of composure doesn't come from training, Sands said, or not from training alone. It comes from knowing something very specifically about who you are under pressure, and being willing to act from that knowledge even when the institution around you is working against you. Lauren looked down the empty sidewalk ahead of her. I'll see you, she said, and ended the call. She stood there for another minute, phone in her hand, the afternoon going on around her without particular concern for what had just happened. Then she put the phone in her pocket and turned around and walked home. She was 3 blocks from her door when the news alert came through on her phone. A local outlet, one of the smaller ones that had been covering the story more carefully than the national accounts. She stopped and read it. Federal investigators have confirmed that the investigation connected to the arrest of DFPD Officer Derek Mast has expanded to include 3 additional members of the department, including Sergeant Walter Creed and 2 supervisory officers. Additionally, sources close to the investigation indicate that a member of the Denton Falls City Attorney's Office is also under scrutiny for their role in suppressing prior misconduct complaints. A press conference is expected tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. She read it twice. Then, below the article, in the recommended stories section, she saw something that made her stop. A secondary piece filed 40 minutes ago from a reporter at the local paper who'd been on the body camera footage story since it broke. The headline read, "Who is Lauren Voss? The nurse at the center of the Mast investigation has a history." No one expected. She opened it. The article was short, 4 paragraphs, clearly filed fast, clearly based on incomplete information. But the 4th paragraph stopped her cold. Sources familiar with the federal investigation have indicated that Voss's classified military service record, partially unsealed in connection with the federal proceedings, contains references to operations and commendations not typically associated with medical personnel. Multiple sources have independently described Voss as having a background significantly more operational than her nursing role would suggest. The Army has declined to comment. Lauren closed the article. She put her phone in her pocket. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the February afternoon, and she thought about the thing that had just changed. Not the investigation, not Mast, not the arrests, not the program at Fort Carson, but the specific thing that she'd kept contained for 3 years. The weight she'd set down somewhere quiet, the identity she'd chosen not to carry in this particular life. It was out of the box now. She thought about how she felt about that, and she was still thinking when her phone rang again. This time, a number she recognized, a 719 area code. Colorado. Fort Carson. It wasn't Sands. It was a number she knew from a different time, a different version of herself. And when she saw it, something in her chest did something complicated that she didn't have a clean word for. She answered it. Voss? Said a voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. It's Tanner. Before you say anything. I already know. I saw the footage, and I need to tell you something before it comes out any other way. Her hand tightened on the phone. What? She said. The contractor, Tanner said. The one in the waiting room footage. The one who queried your record. A pause. Very short, very precise. He's not just connected to Mast. Lauren, I know who he is. We've worked with him, both of us. And if his name comes out in that press conference tomorrow, tell me, she said. Tanner told her. And Lauren stood on the sidewalk in the February afternoon while the world she'd been carefully building for 3 years shifted under her feet, in a way she hadn't seen coming, and for the first time in 2 days, her hands weren't entirely steady. She didn't move for a long moment after Tanner finished talking. The name he'd given her sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. Marcus Fell. She knew it the way you know a thing you've tried to put distance between yourself and, not forgotten, just set somewhere you'd decided not to look. Fell had been a contractor embedded with the unit during her last deployment. Logistics and Intelligence Interface, the official designation, which was the kind of title that meant something specific to the people who assigned it, and very little to anyone outside that room. He'd been competent. He'd been careful. She'd never trusted him, not specifically, not for any reason she could have articulated at the time. She just noted the quality of his attention and filed it and moved on. Now Fell's name was in a federal investigation, connected to Mast, connected to a query on her classified record, connected to 12 years of a woman hiding in a mid-sized Montana city, hoping the past had lost her address. How long have you known? She said. I didn't know until 4 hours ago, Tanner said. Someone in the CID network flagged it to me directly because of our overlap on the record. Lauren, he had access to a lot of things he shouldn't still have access to. If the press conference tomorrow names him publicly, it puts operational information in a news cycle. It puts names in a news cycle. Personnel who are still active. You understand what I'm saying? She understood. The investigation had grown past Mast, past Creed, past the city attorney's office, and it was now touching something that had reach. The contractor in this waiting room footage wasn't just mass resource. He was a thread that, pulled hard enough in public, could unravel things that had nothing to do with Denton Falls or a hospital ER or a nurse who wouldn't move a detainee up the triage list. Corver needs to know this before 10 a.m. tomorrow, Lauren said. That's why I called you. You could have called her directly. I don't have her number, Tanner said, and she's more likely to take a 2 a.m. call from someone she's already working with. A pause. That's you, Voss. She was already walking again, moving without deciding to, her feet sorting out the direction while her mind was somewhere else. She'd done that her whole life, the body operating on its own sensible logic while the brain caught up. Tanner, she said, is there anything else? Anything you know that I don't? A silence on his end, the kind that was not empty. Fell was going through your record because Mast asked him to, Tanner said. But Mast asked him to because someone told Mast who you were. Before the ER. Before the complaint. Someone flagged your name to Mast and said this is the nurse at Callaway Regional, Watch out for her. Lauren stopped walking again. Someone told Mast about me, she said, before I ever met him. That's what the access log suggests. The initial query on your name was 11 days ago. Your interaction in the ER was 2 days ago. She stood on the sidewalk and did the math, and felt something cold and precise settle in behind her sternum. Someone had known she was at Callaway Regional, known her background, pointed Mast at her, not to threaten her specifically, not yet, but to make sure he knew what he was dealing with if she became a problem. And then she had become a problem, and he'd panicked, and a man who panics reaches for the tools he has, and the tool he had was Fell. Who pointed him at me? She said. We don't know yet, Tanner said. Corver's team will. By morning, probably. He paused. I'm sorry, Lauren. I know you built something there. I know you were not hiding, but living quietly. I know this wasn't what you wanted. She thought about that, about what living quietly had actually been. The far parking space, the badge on her scrubs, coffee in the dark before her shift, Alcazar, who actually listened, Pat Drury and her 26 years, Josie in Bay 8, learning to read a trend line before it became a crisis. It's still mine, she said, the life I built there. That part doesn't change. No, Tanner said. It doesn't. She called Corver at 2:14 a.m. Corver picked up on the second ring, which told Lauren everything she needed to know about how much Corver was actually sleeping. She laid it out exactly as Tanner had given it to her. Fell, the timeline of the initial query, the operational exposure risk if the name went public before it was properly contained. She was precise, and she was brief, and she did not editorialize. When she finished, Corver was quiet for a moment. The press conference tomorrow, Lauren said. The names. I heard you, Corver said. Her voice was not defensive. It was the voice of someone adjusting in real time to information that required adjustment. I'll make calls. The name won't be in the 10 a.m. briefing. Another pause. Fell will still be charged. It just won't be announced with the others. Okay, Lauren said. Voss? Corver's voice shifted slightly. Not softer exactly, but with a different quality, more direct. I need to ask you something. Go ahead. The person who flagged your identity to Mast 11 days ago. When we find out who it is, and we will find out, there's a chance it's someone you know, given the overlap between your service record and Fell's history. A pause. I want you to be prepared for that. Lauren looked at the ceiling of her bedroom. She'd made it back to her house without remembering the walk, which was a thing that happened sometimes. I've been prepared for things I didn't see coming my whole career, she said. That part I can handle. She didn't sleep after the call. She lay in the dark and did what she'd learned to do in places where sleep wasn't possible. She rested. Breathing even, body still, mind not exactly quiet but running at a lower frequency, processing without spinning. It was a skill like any other. She'd gotten good at it the hard way. At 5:15, she got up, showered, made coffee she actually finished this time, and drove to Callaway Regional for her 6 a.m. shift. The press conference happened at 10 a.m. exactly. Lauren was in the middle of a blood draw when Josie came in to tell her it was starting, and she finished the draw, labeled the tubes, and went to the break room where someone had set a tablet against the microwave so people could watch. There were 6 of them in the break room. Lauren, Josie, 2 techs, a respiratory therapist named Gail, who almost never came to the break room, and Terry from the ICU, who had come down for reasons that were unclear but probably not coincidental. Corver stood at the podium. She was in a dark suit, hair back, and she looked like someone who had been awake for most of the preceding 24 hours and had decided, as a professional matter, that it was not going to show. She named Mast. She named Creed. She named the 2 supervisory officers, a lieutenant named Frank Dabrowski and a shift commander named Roy Pittman, who Lauren recognized from the news but had never encountered. She named the assistant city attorney, a man named Jeffrey Stills, who had received copies of 3 separate internal misconduct complaints against Mast in the previous 4 years and had taken no action on any of them. The charges were read in legal language that was precise and thorough and left nothing decorative. Obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, conspiracy to suppress official misconduct reports, abuse of authority, and for Stills specifically, dereliction of duty and misconduct in public office. Fell was not named. The operational thread was, for now, contained. At the end of the formal charges, Corver paused. She looked up from the document she'd been reading, and she said something that was not in the legal language. In connection with this investigation, the FBI and Army CID wish to acknowledge that the actions of one individual, a civilian nurse working at Callaway Regional Medical Center in Denton Falls, were directly responsible for preserving evidence and protecting a federal witness at considerable personal and professional cost. That individual did not have prior knowledge of the investigation. She was not acting on anyone's instruction. She was doing her job, and when her job put her in the path of a pattern of institutional corruption, she did not step aside. Corver looked at the camera. Her name is Lauren Voss. The record reflects that every action she took was professional, documented, and correct. In the break room, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Gail, the respiratory therapist who almost never came to the break room, said, "Holy," and stopped herself. Lauren looked at the tablet for another second and then looked at the wall. "Okay," she said. "I've got a patient in 4. The next several weeks were not a clean upward line. Nothing real ever was. There were days when the attention was manageable and days when it wasn't. When the news coverage found its way into her shift in the form of patients who recognized her name, or administrators who wanted to discuss optics, or a journalist who had somehow gotten her personal cell number and called 3 times before she blocked it. There were days when she came home and sat at the kitchen table with cold coffee and felt the specific weight of having had her private life made legible to people she'd never met, and she didn't entirely know what to do with that weight except carry it, the way she'd carried other weights until it reconfigured into something livable. The investigation expanded, as investigations do. The name Fell came out 3 weeks after the press conference, in a federal filing rather than a public announcement, and the operational exposure Tanner had worried about was managed, not perfectly, but well enough, through a combination of redaction and classification reviews that Lauren didn't have full visibility into and didn't need. What she knew was that Fell was charged, that his security clearance was revoked, and that the thread connecting him to the original query on her record led, eventually, to a retired officer who had been paid to provide information about Callaway Regional's staff composition to a private firm connected to Mast's network. The retired officer's name was no one Lauren knew. That had been Corver's warning, and it had been a correct warning, and Lauren was glad not to know the name. Some anticipated things didn't happen, and that was its own relief. Raina Souza, the detective who'd been pulled off her internal investigation and moved to a desk, submitted her documentation to Corver's team the morning after calling Pat Drury. It added 17 pages of specific, dated, corroborated evidence to the case, exactly the kind of material that moved a conviction from probable to inevitable. At the formal proceedings, Souza testified in person, and Lauren watched the live feed from the break room the same way she'd watched the press conference. And Souza's voice did not shake, and Lauren thought about what Souza had said about the nurse doing it in public, and felt something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite kinship, but lived in the same neighborhood as both. Glenda Marsh recovered. That happened in stages, the way septic recovery always did. Not a straight line, not a dramatic morning where she sat up and was fine, but a series of incremental returns. Pressure stabilized. Mentation cleared. The infection retreated under the antibiotics, and then under a secondary course, and then it was gone, and she was left with the particular fragility of someone who had been very sick and knows it, who has looked at the specific gap between what happened and what could have happened and come back changed. Lauren learned this through channels, a note from Reardon, who learned it from the secure facilities medical team. She didn't meet Glenda Marsh. She didn't expect to. The patient and the nurse existed on either side of a professional line that Lauren was careful about, had always been careful about, because the alternative was a kind of involvement that made everything harder. But 3 months after the arrest, a card arrived at the hospital, addressed to the nursing staff, with no return address, written in the careful handwriting of someone who'd had to work back up to it. For the people who didn't move. Thank you. Pat Drury put it on the bulletin board in the break room, next to the shift schedule and the expired CPR certification reminder, and it stayed there. The meeting with Dr. Harriet Sands happened on a Thursday afternoon in late March. in a conference room at a government building in Billings that Lauren drove to because she preferred driving to flying when the distance was manageable. Sands was shorter than Lauren had imagined from the phone, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting down and forgetting, and the kind of direct attention that didn't perform itself. It just was there, continuous and undiverted. They talked for 2 hours. The program Sands described was real, and it was needed, and it was the kind of work that Lauren had not let herself want for 3 years because wanting it would have meant acknowledging that there was a version of herself that hadn't entirely retired when she left the Army. A version that still moved toward mass casualty situations rather than away. A version that read terrain differently, thought about medical resources in contexts where the supply chain was not a given, understood that the people most likely to die in an austere environment were not the ones with the most severe injuries, but the ones with the least coordinated response around them. She'd been using that version of herself every day at Callaway Regional. She just hadn't named it. "It's not a departure from what you're doing," Sands said. "I want to be honest with you about what I'm asking for. Your ER patients are still your ER patients. This is additional. Some travel, some training blocks, some curriculum development." She looked at Lauren over the reading glasses she'd just put back on. "I'm also asking for something harder to quantify." "What?" "I want people who don't know how to fold themselves small when an institution pushes back." Sands said it plainly, without making it sound like a speech. "I've had people with your operational background who couldn't make it work in a civilian medical context. I've had people with strong clinical backgrounds who couldn't operate under pressure without the full institutional apparatus around them. What I need is the specific thing you demonstrated in that ER, which is the capacity to know exactly who you are in a situation where you're being told you're the problem." She paused. "That's the actual skill." Lauren sat with that for a moment. She thought about the Monday morning 2 months ago. She thought about the triage list and Glenda Marsh's mottled skin and the supply closet and 45 seconds of being alone and the choice to go back out. She thought about Fosse's office and the way she'd asked for everything in writing and the way Lyle's pen had stopped moving. She thought about Pat Drury's 26 years and Josie's patient in Bay 8 and the specific weight of Robert Huang's death, which she still carried the way she carried all of them, not as a burden, but as a fact that had shaped her. "Okay," Lauren said. Sands looked at her. "Okay, I'll take the role?" "Okay. I understand what you're asking for," Lauren said. "And yes, I'll take it." She drove back to Denton Falls the same day. The mountains were doing the thing they did in late March. The snow line had retreated partway up, and the lower slopes were showing the specific pale green of early growth that looked tentative until you'd seen it long enough to know it was actually very determined. She drove with the window cracked and the heater on and felt the specific texture of a decision that couldn't be undone, which was not as frightening as people who hadn't made many such decisions imagined it to be. She was back in the ER by 6 a.m. the next morning. Josie was there before her, which was becoming a pattern. Her patient from Bay 8 had been discharged, home, recovering, and she'd moved on to 2 new cases with the particular focused attention of someone who was figuring out by doing what they were actually good at. "You're in a weird mood," Josie said, which was Josie's version of perceptive. "I made a decision yesterday," Lauren said. "Good one or bad one?" Lauren considered that. "Both, probably," she said. "I'll let you know how it shakes out." She went to the board, read the overnight report, and started her shift. In May, at a ceremony at Callaway Regional that Lauren had been told about only a week before and had spent that week mostly not thinking about, the hospital presented her with a formal commendation for professional conduct and patient advocacy. Fosse was not the one who handed it to her. He'd been quietly moved to a regional administrative role following a review of hospital policies, which was the institutional equivalent of a consequence and not nothing, even if it wasn't everything. The regional director, Anita Park, presented it instead, and she did so in the ER rather than an auditorium, which had been Lauren's only specific request. The staff was there. Alcazar, who shook her hand and said simply, "You were right about Marsh," which was the most Alcazar thing anyone could have said. Pat Drury, who stood in the back with her arms crossed and her expression carefully controlled and failed for about 5 seconds to control it. Josie, who had to be told not to film it on her phone and filmed it anyway from a slightly more concealed angle. Lauren held the commendation, a framed document, formal language, the hospital's seal, and thought about what to say, because Park had said she could say something if she wanted to, and she found that she did want to. She looked at the room, her room, the bays and the boards and the monitoring equipment and the people who moved through this space every day doing a job that asked too much and paid too little, and was still, for reasons nobody could entirely explain, something they chose. "I don't think I did anything exceptional," she said. "That's not false modesty. I followed triage protocol, and I documented what happened, and I didn't move when someone wanted me to move, for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine." She paused. "The exceptional part, if there was one, was that I happened to be someone who was difficult to intimidate. And that's not a virtue exactly. It's just a history." She looked at the commendation in her hands. "What I keep thinking about are the people who didn't have that history, who did the same right thing and got pushed out anyway because they were doing it alone, without whatever particular armoring I had." She looked up. "That's the part I want to be different. Not for me. That part's already resolved. For the next person who's standing at a triage desk trying to do the right thing with no one behind them." Alcazar nodded once. Pat Drury had given up controlling her expression. Lauren put the commendation down on the nursing station counter, not dismissively, just setting it somewhere solid, and looked at the board. "Is there anything critical?" she said. "Bay 2, Josie said, already moving. "Abdominal, came in 20 minutes ago. Alcazar wants a second set of eyes." "Let's go," Lauren said, and she went. The trial came in October. Mast was convicted on all counts: obstruction, intimidation, conspiracy, the false complaint against Lauren specifically. Creed and Dabrowski and Pittman received convictions on their respective charges. Stills, the assistant city attorney, was convicted of dereliction and misconduct and disbarred within 30 days of the verdict. Fell was tried separately, later, in a federal court in Denver, and convicted of unauthorized access to classified records and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. The contractor firm he'd worked for had its government contracts terminated. The retired officer who'd provided Lauren's information was charged with selling protected personnel data and took a plea. The sentencing was public, as it had to be. Mast received 7 years. He was not eligible for law enforcement employment of any kind upon release. The others received sentences proportional to their roles, and the city of Denton Falls agreed to a reform audit of the police department conducted by an independent oversight body, which was both less than it should have been and more than it would have been a year before. Lauren did not attend the trial or the sentencing. She followed it the way she followed things she needed to know about, practically, briefly, without making it the center of anything. She was at work when the verdict came in. She heard about it from her phone, the way she'd heard about most of it. She acknowledged it internally, the way you acknowledge when a long noise finally stops, and then she went back to her shift. The women in Pat Drury's log, the nurses, the administrative staff, the one paramedic, some of them were eventually reached by Corver's team and given the opportunity to have their cases reviewed. 2 of the complaint records were formally expunged. One woman, a nurse who'd left the profession, was located and contacted and offered a pathway back if she wanted it. Lauren didn't know if she took it. She hoped she did, but she understood if she didn't. Some doors close, and the fact that someone offers to reopen them doesn't make walking back through them simple. What Lauren knew was that the attempt had been made. That was not nothing. She drove home on a Tuesday evening in November. Dark by 5 now, the mountain line invisible against the sky, the city's lights doing their usual work of making the dark seem less complete than it was. And she sat in her car in the driveway for a moment before going in. She'd been thinking about something Sands had said in their second meeting at Fort Carson, when they were working through curriculum design for the joint training program, and the conversation had drifted, the way those conversations sometimes did, into something more honest. "What made you apply to nursing?" Sands had asked, after everything else, and Lauren had thought about it for a real moment before answering. "Because the work is true," she'd said. "Whatever else is wrong with the institution, the patient is real. The injury is real. The decision matters. I needed something where the thing in front of me was true." Sands had nodded like that was exactly what she'd expected, which meant it was probably exactly what she'd needed to hear. Lauren got out of the car and went inside and made coffee she would probably finish and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a few minutes, which was not the same as it used to be. It used to be waiting for something. Now it was just the quiet before the next thing, which was a different quality of the same silence. She was not a hero. She knew that with the same precision she knew most things about herself. Without sentiment, without false modesty, just clearly. She was a person who had been in the right place with the right preparation and the right stubbornness, and who had declined, at every opportunity, to be less than she was. That was available to more people than they were told. That was the thing she thought about most, in the months after all of it. Not the trial, not the verdict, not the commendation on the nursing station counter. Not even Glenda Marsh's card on the break room bulletin board, though she thought about that too. She thought about the person standing at the desk the next time. The person who doesn't have the armoring, who doesn't have the service record, who has only the right thing and the pressure not to do it, and the very human question of whether they are enough, alone, to hold the line. They don't need to be exceptional. They need to be persistent and documented and unwilling to be smaller than the situation requires. They need to know that doing the right thing inside a system that pushes back is not a personal failure. It's the whole test. She'd learned that too. Not from the Army, not from the ER, but from the specific Monday morning when a man with a badge decided she was nothing, and she'd known, with everything she'd built and survived and carried, that he was wrong. And she had not moved. That was it. That was all of it. She had simply, at every moment that asked it of her, not moved. Her coffee was hot. Outside the window, the mountains were there in the dark, enormous and indifferent and exactly where they'd always been. She drank her coffee and listened to the quiet and let tomorrow be tomorrow, and the kitchen was warm, and she was still here, and that was more than enough.